In March of 2015, 54-year-old Cheryl Silvanic discovered that her teenage daughter Jamie Lynn had lied about the age of her older boyfriend, U.S. Army soldier Caleb Gregory Barnes. Jamie had told her mother that Barnes was 17 years old, but he was really 20, and Cheryl ordered her daughter to end the relationship. Several days later, Barnes stopped at the Silvanic family's home while Jamie was at school and talked to Cheryl. Despite her disapproval of the couple's relationship, she agreed to drive them to a Breaking Benjamin concert in Scranton later that evening. Early the next morning, Cheryl was found stabbed to death in a shallow grave roughly 8 miles from her home, with her car submerged in a nearby pond. A short while later, police found Jamie and Barnes in the teen's bedroom and arrested them on suspicion of murder. Phone records reveal that the pair had spent the entire evening of the concert plotting to kill Cheryl. They murdered her in her vehicle in the family's driveway after the show. Barnes accused Jamie of being the actual killer, despite prosecutors' claims that he had carried out the stabbing. He was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life without parole. Jamie admitted to her role in the crime and sought to mitigate her circumstances based on her age, but the judge ordered for her to be tried as an adult. She pleaded guilty to murder and was sentenced to 35 years in prison. Now in her early 20s, Jamie is attempting to get her plea conviction and sentence tossed on the grounds of ineffective counsel. She's accusing the court and prosecutors of failing to consider her mental health issues and the abusive nature of her relationship with Barnes, who she claims was coercive and controlling. The outcome of her appeal remains to be seen. Number 23. Natasha Ellis. In May of 2019, a young woman named Natasha Ellis attacked her friend's family at their home in New Carlisle, Ohio, as part of a plot to kill the victims. She fatally stabbed her friend's mother, 36-year-old Lee A. Moore, and wounded the friend's father and brother, who survived their injuries. Ellis and her friend had planned to kill the family, but only Ellis followed through with it. She told police that her friend was being mistreated and that she had no choice but to murder the victims in order to put an end to it. Prosecutors charged the teen as an adult, and in June of 2020, about a year after the incident, Ellis pleaded guilty to murder and attempted murder. In exchange for her plea, the state dropped aggravated murder and felonious assault charges. As part of the agreement, Ellis also agreed to testify against her co-defendant, who was charged as a juvenile. She was sentenced to 22 years in prison. In 2022, a Clark County court granted Ellis a new trial after she successfully challenged the previous decision to charge her as an adult. She argued her case based on a mental health evaluation and certain other factors, and the court concluded that she should have remained in the juvenile system. Now that she's nearly an adult, however, Ellis will remain in regular prison. Records show that she was resentenced to 15 years to life. She'll become eligible for parole in 2034 at the age of 27. Number 22. Davus Smith. In January of 2022, Davus Smith shot a fellow student, 18-year-old Javon McIntyre, inside their high school in Sanford, Florida. McIntyre survived 3 gunshot wounds, and Smith was charged with several crimes in connection with the incident. According to a police report, Smith claimed that McIntyre had been taunting him between classes about a dead relative, while school officials denied that bullying played a role in the altercation. In July of 2024, he pleaded guilty to attempted first-degree murder, discharge of a weapon on school property, and shooting into a building or vehicle. Despite charging Smith as an adult, the state waived the 25-year mandatory minimum sentence for discharging a firearm and causing great bodily harm. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison with credit for nearly 2.5 years of time served, followed by 5 years of probation. Following his release in 2037, Smith will be required to wear a GPS ankle monitor for the entirety of his probation. He'll also have to complete various mental health, anger management, and life skills courses during that time. Number 21. Marlee Gardner. 20-year-old Madison Hahn and 19-year-old Tyler Christensen were killed in Roy, Utah in June of 2016 when their sedan was rear-ended in the middle of the night by an SUV traveling at 100 miles per hour in a 45-mile-per-hour zone. The impact of the high-speed crash sent the victims' Hyundai Sonata into a traffic signal pole, killing Han at the scene. Christensen succumbed to his injuries at a nearby hospital. The SUV driver, Marlee Gardner, attempted to flee the scene by driving into a field, but she only made it a few yards before her vehicle stopped. She admitted to causing the accident on purpose and was charged with 2 counts of murder, failing to stop at the command of police and failing to remain at the scene of a fatal accident. In 2017, Gardner pleaded guilty to 2 counts of attempted murder in exchange for the murder charges being dropped. She was convicted as a minor on 1 of the charges and was sentenced to 4 years in a juvenile facility, and she was convicted as an adult on the other charge, which carries a sentence of 3 years to life. During her sentencing hearing, Gardner tearfully apologized for her actions, but her words came as little, if any, comfort to the victims' families, who felt let down by the system and believed that the defendant had received an overly lenient sentence. After turning 21, Gardner was transferred to an adult prison to continue serving her time. It's unclear how long she'll remain in prison. Number 20. Curtis and Catherine Jones. In 1999, Catherine Jones and her brother, Curtis, became desperate to escape the mistreatment they suffered at the hands of a family member at their home in Port St. John, Florida. Feeling like they had no other choice, the siblings plotted to murder their abuser, their father, and their father's girlfriend, 29-year-old Sonia Nicole Spites. They fatally shot Spites and were apprehended before they could kill anyone else. The victim was not suspected of harming the children in any way, but they didn't know how else to handle their problems at their young age. Following Spites' death, Catherine and Curtis were charged as adults with first-degree murder. Prosecutors accused the pair of killing Spites because they were jealous of the attention she received from their father, but a look into the family's past revealed that there had been numerous instances of suspected harm against the siblings, yet no action was taken to relocate them to a safer environment. The brother and sister both pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and were sentenced to 18 years in prison, followed by lifetime felony probation. They were released in prison in 2015 at the ages of 29 and 30. Many people believe that Catherine and Curtis were treated unfairly by the justice system and that they wouldn't have killed anyone if someone had removed them from their home. They've received help petitioning for clemency in hopes of obtaining a pardon or at least shortening their sentences, but it has not been granted. Number 19. Brenda Spencer. In January of 1979, high school student Brenda Spencer skipped school and fired 30 gunshots into a school across the street from her San Diego home with a semi-automatic rifle, killing the principal and custodian and wounding 8 students and an emergency responder. After the shooting, she barricaded herself inside her home, leading to a 6-hour standoff with law enforcement before she finally surrendered. Just a year earlier, Spencer had fired a BB gun at the school, shattering a window. No one was hurt and she had been sentenced to probation in that case. In the months leading up to the shooting, her probation officer had recommended seeking inpatient psychiatric care for depression, but the young woman's father refused to admit her to a facility for treatment, claiming that he had the situation under control. And he bought his daughter a gun for Christmas later that year. After the shooting, Spencer told a San Diego Union Tribune reporter that she didn't like Mondays, adding, "This livens up the day." It was a quote that went on to live in infamy for years to come, even inspiring a song by the Irish band, the Boomtown Rats. Spencer's attorneys hoped to pursue an insanity defense, but this never happened. She was charged as an adult, and in 1980 she pleaded guilty to 2 counts of murder. 9 attempted murder charges were dropped in exchange for the plea, and Spencer was sentenced to 2 consecutive prison terms of 25 years to life. She remains behind bars to this day. Number 18. Billy Underwood and Dylan Martin. In November of 2015, a trio of teenagers ambushed 86-year-old Hazel Abel outside her Kennewick, Washington home and forced her and her dog into the trunk of her car. 6 hours later, the elderly woman and her canine companion managed to escape from their captors at a Walmart store near Portland, Oregon. Authorities identified the culprits as Billy Underwood, Caitlin Kenfield, and Abel's great-grandson, Dylan Martin. They were charged with first-degree kidnapping, first-degree burglary, and car theft. According to prosecutors, the accused captors waited outside Abel's home until nightfall and unscrewed a porch light bulb. When she stepped outside, They threw dirt in her face, covered her head, and gagged and bound her. The state accused Underwood and Muton of plotting to leave the senior citizen off in a remote area to succumb to the elements. They were both charged as adults, and in 2016, they were convicted as charged. Dylan Muton was sentenced to 9.5 years in prison and was ordered to never contact his great-grandmother again, while Billy Underwood received a 10.5-year prison sentence after admitting to doing more of the dirty work. Despite being charged as adults, the boys were ordered to begin their sentences in a juvenile facility and for their cases to be revisited once they turned 18. Number 17. Jordan Roach. In June of 2017, a high school student named Caitlin Cargill was reported missing from her apartment complex in Bedford, Texas. Her murdered body was found in an Arlington landfill 2 days later. Based on witness accounts, police identified a fellow teenager named Jordan Roach as the last person Cargill was seen with. The young woman had gone to buy marijuana from Roach shortly before she vanished. Roach was also connected to the crime through blood spatter found inside his girlfriend's apartment. Investigators also recovered the suspected murder weapon, a claw hammer, from the residence. In April of 2022, nearly 5 years after Cargill's death, Roach pleaded guilty to first-degree murder in exchange for a 10-year prison sentence with credit for 5 years served. For Cargill's mother, Tricia West, the outcome of the case represented a far cry from justice. Speaking with NBC5, West made it clear that she was extremely disappointed with the sentence, which she described during a victim impact statement as the deal of a lifetime. Number 16. Aiden Lee. Mario Davus Smith Jr. was at a house party in Fort Wayne, Indiana, in November of 2023 when he started to get worried about the increasingly rowdy nature of the gathering. He called his cousin to express his concerns and was shot twice in the chest during the conversation. By the time Smith's aunt and uncle tracked his phone to the residence and rushed over there, emergency responders were attempting to save his life. Their efforts were futile, and Smith died from his injuries. According to the young man's family, Smith had tried to break up a fight shortly before he was shot. They described him as a good kid who stayed out of trouble and essentially happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Following an investigation, prosecutors charged a teenager named Aiden Lee with Smith's murder. The two men knew each other through Smith's girlfriend, who had dated Lee in the past. On the night of the murder, Lee came to the house and was upset to discover that Smith was there, leading to an argument between Lee and his ex, and ultimately Smith's death. According to authorities, Lee later received a text message from the young woman stating that he had killed Smith for no reason. He was tried as an adult, which meant that he faced up to 65 years in prison if convicted. In May of 2024, a jury found him guilty of murder. He was sentenced to 55 years in prison, which means that he'll most likely spend the rest of his life behind bars. Number 15. Max Wade. In 2011, a teenager from California's Bay Area broke into the showroom of a British Motors car dealership in San Francisco, where he stole a banana yellow Lamborghini belonging to celebrity chef Guy Fieri. Max Wade was unaware that Fieri had just purchased the car, which he used in an attempt to gain the attention of a young woman he was interested in. His crush was unimpressed. Several months later, Wade lay in wait along a street on his motorcycle and shot at a passing truck being driven by the woman's boyfriend. The woman was riding in the passenger seat, and both she and her boyfriend narrowly avoided being struck by the gunfire. By then, Wade had already essentially established himself as a career criminal. Despite his young age, he had started selling fake IDs at the tender age of 14, profiting to the tune of hundreds of thousands of dollars. Wade was identified as the suspected drive-by shooter based on surveillance footage of the crime. Working with detectives, the woman he had a crush on persuaded him to meet up with her for a date in his stolen Lamborghini. Police made their move and apprehended the teen, who was charged as an adult with various crimes. In 2014, Wade was found guilty of attempted murder, auto theft and possession of a stolen vehicle. He was sentenced to 21 years to life in prison. Wade appealed his case, and in 2021, his sentence was reduced to 10 years. He was paroled in 2024, much to the disappointment of Marin County District Attorney Lori Frugoli. who described Wade's release as shocking, frightening, and disappointing. The decision to parole was praised by Wade's lawyer, who said that his client had stayed out of trouble while in prison and had successfully navigated the challenges of incarcerated life. He did not believe that Wade posed a danger to the community, while Frugoli made it clear that she felt otherwise. Number 14. The Broken Arrow Murders. Late one night in July of 2015, police in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma, responded to a 911 call from a boy who said his brother was attacking their family. Upon arriving at the residence, officers found the front porch covered in blood. Inside the house, they found an injured teenage girl and an unharmed toddler, who were promptly removed from the scene and taken to safety. The 911 caller had been stabbed to death along with two of his siblings and his parents, 52-year-old David Bever and his 44-year-old wife, April. One of the survivors identified their brothers, 18-year-old Robert Bever and 16-year-old Michael Bever, as the killers. The pair were apprehended in the woods behind the residence. Robert and Michael had drawn up detailed plans to kill their family, indicating that the massacre was premeditated. They were each charged with 5 counts of first-degree murder, and both brothers were tried as adults. Neighbors told reporters that the Bevers typically kept to themselves. The 7 children were homeschooled, and the family interacted so little with the community that their neighbors didn't even know the kids' names. Robert told police that he killed his family because he wanted to go down in history as a prolific serial killer. He claimed that he and Michael had planned to continue killing until they amassed at least 50 victims. They craved fame and recognition and hoped to supersede infamous killers like James Egan Holmes, who opened fire on a packed movie theater in 2012, and the Columbine shooters. In 2016, Robert pleaded guilty to 5 counts of murder and was sentenced to 5 consecutive life terms. Michael took his case to trial in 2018 and was found guilty, and is also serving life without parole. Number 13. Kym Curenton. During the summer of 2022, police in Columbus, Ohio, were called to the scene of a reported shooting in the city's South Linden neighborhood, where they found 30-year-old Lillia King clinging to life with a gunshot wound in her car. The single mother had gotten caught in the middle of a shootout between 2 groups outside a convenience store. She died from her injuries at a local hospital 3 hours later. Police released surveillance images of the suspects, leading to the identification of a teenager named Kym Curenton as one of the parties involved in the violence. He was charged with involuntary manslaughter, reckless homicide, and having weapons while under disability. Curenton initially pleaded not guilty to the charges, and prosecutors announced that they planned to try him as an adult. 6 months after his arrest, he changed his plea to guilty. He was sentenced to consecutive sentences totaling 7 to 9 years, including 4 to 6 years for manslaughter and 3 years for the weapons charge. Number 12. Kaden Smith. In October of 2021, an off-duty police officer discovered the murdered bodies of 22-year-old Michael James Jr., 18-year-old Joseph Thomas, and 17-year-old Abdullah Mubarak in a wooded area in Indianapolis. All 3 men had been shot, and investigators traced the crime to a teenager named Kaden Smith, who had been in contact with the victims shortly before their deaths. Evidence showed that Smith had lured the men into the woods over a 2-day period with promises to show them how a Glock switch works. The teen was also connected to the crime through other evidence, including drugs and cell phones containing incriminating internet searches about covering up a crime. Much to the frustration of prosecutors and the victims' families, a Marion County judge released Smith on an ankle monitor in October 2022 as the case waited to go to trial. The judge also threw out key evidence in the case after ruling that a search had violated Smith's Fourth Amendment rights. Smith soon landed back in custody after posting photos of himself on Snapchat with drugs and guns. He was charged with a laundry list of crimes including multiple counts of murder, felony murder, robbery resulted in serious bodily injury, resisting law enforcement, and various drug and gun-related counts. After numerous delays, the case finally went to trial in 2024, nearly 3 years after the murders. Smith was tried as an adult, and a jury found him guilty. He's currently serving sentences totaling nearly 200 years, effectively amounting to a life sentence. Number 11. Kiona Muton. In November of 2018, 18-year-old Lindsay Mack was shot 7 times by 2 men at an apartment complex near his high school in Houston, Texas. The shooters fled the scene in a getaway car driven by a man named Davon Thomas. Investigators identified one of the gunmen as 19-year-old Kendrick Johnson, a known gang member, with connection to at least 6 other murders, while the other shooter remains at large. The victim is lured to his death by a classmate he had a crush on, Kiona Muton, in what prosecutors described as a targeted killing amid an ongoing gang war. Muton suddenly disappeared while walking with Mac and another girl. Just moments later, the shooters pulled up to the scene and opened fire on Mac. One of the gunmen stood over the victim and continued shooting as he lay on the ground, executing him in cold blood. Mac had recently transferred to the nearby high school in order to escape gang violence at his previous school. His family thought he was safe there, which only added to their devastation over his death. Johnson was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life in prison, while the getaway driver, Davon Thomas, received a 50-year sentence for his role in the crime. Muton was just a teen at the time of the shooting, but was tried as an adult. In August of 2024, she was found guilty of murder and sentenced to 23 years in prison. Number 10. John Totherow. In May of 2022, 56-year-old Alethea Puckett Totherow was found dead from multiple gunshot wounds inside her York, South Carolina home. Neighbors looked on as dozens of police cars and a SWAT team swarmed the property and blocked the street. Law enforcement spent hours at the scene, where they believed an armed intruder was barricaded inside the residence. When the chaos finally calmed down, it was revealed that police had arrested Alethea's teenage son, John Totherow, with her murder. John had shot his mother 6 times. He was initially charged in juvenile court with murder, but in 2023 he pleaded guilty as an adult to voluntary manslaughter and possession of a weapon during a violent crime. Totherow was sentenced to 28 years in prison. His father, Kenny, told the court that he had kissed his wife goodbye before leaving the house on the day of the murder, unaware that it was the last time he would ever see her. He said he didn't want John to serve life in prison, and that he was in a difficult position as he accepted that he may never see his son again. Kenny said that he still loved John, despite the horrific nature of his son's actions. Number 9. Myron Dantrell Clancy. Myron Dantrell Clancy was just 15 years old when he fatally shot another teenager, Jonathan Deshawn Finney, outside an Alberta, Alabama convenience store in March of 2008. The 2 young men were embroiled in a long-standing dispute over a car at the time of the shooting, and Clancy was arrested shortly thereafter following the discovery of the murder weapon at a relative's home. The case initially landed in juvenile court, and Clancy's mother asked the court to involuntarily commit her son to a psychiatric facility, but he was tried as an adult and found guilty of murder, landing him a 40-year prison sentence. In May of 2024, Clancy went before the parole board in hopes of regaining his freedom. Several people spoke against his release, including Finney's mother and brother, a representative of the State Attorney General's office, and a representative for the non-profit advocacy group Victims of Crime and Leniency. The only person to speak in support of Clancy's release was his daughter, and his parole was denied. His next hearing is scheduled for 2029. Number 8. Sarah Cruzan. In 1995, a California teenager named Sarah Cruzan killed her pimp, George Gilbert Howard, who had started grooming and trafficking her several years earlier. She robbed and shot Howard at a San Diego motel at the command of her boyfriend, who threatened to kill Cruzan if she failed to follow through with his orders. The young woman also pulled the trigger because she thought Howard was about to harm her, and she was terrified to relive past trauma. Cruzan stole $1,500 from Howard's wallet and fled the scene in his Jaguar. She left her person ID at the scene, which made it easy for police to connect her to the crime, following the discovery of Howard's body by a motel housekeeper. During questioning, the teen confessed to the shooting and was subsequently charged with murder. Prosecutors tried Cruzan as an adult, despite the defense's attempts to keep the case in juvenile court. During her trial, she testified that she shot Howard out of fear for her own safety and the safety of her mother. The prosecution framed her in a much different light, reminding jurors not to let Cruzan's petite and youthful appearance sway them into thinking she was incapable of murder. The jury found Cruzan guilty, resulting in a life sentence without the possibility of parole. Over the years, her case garnered the attention of dedicated and influential activists who believed that Cruzan's sentence was excessively harsh given her circumstances and age at the time of the shooting. Many of her supporters also felt that a life sentence without parole was inappropriate for a minor, period, regardless of their crime. In early 2011, then Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger granted clemency, reducing Cruzan's sentence to 25 years with the possibility of parole. Her sentence was further reduced to 19 years in 2013, and she was paroled later that year. California's current governor, Gavin Newsom, pardoned Cruzan in 2022. Cruzan is fighting to change laws surrounding the sentencing of trafficking victims who are convicted of crimes. A proposed federal bill dubbed Sarah's Law, and also known as the Preventing Unfair Sentencing Act, would give judges the authority to impose reduced sentences with a treatment-based focus for survivors. The legislation is currently working its way through Congress, where it has received backing from bipartisan representatives. Number 7. David and Brian Freeman. Brothers David and Brian Freeman were raised by devout Jehovah's Witnesses in Salisbury Township, Pennsylvania. During their teens, they grew to resent their family's faith and instead turned to neo-Nazism. The Freeman's mother, Brenda, grew fearful of her sons as she witnessed the disturbing changes in their personalities and beliefs. In addition to shaving their heads and wearing military garb, David and Brian tattooed their foreheads with the Nazi slogans Berserker and Sieg Heil. They also began experiencing disciplinary and mental health issues, with Brian landing in a psychiatric hospital while David shuffled between juvenile detention facilities and drug rehab. Brenda did everything in her power to deter the boys from falling any deeper into the white supremacist subculture, but her efforts were futile. Over a 2-year period started in 1993, police were dispatched to the family's home at least 5 times in response to altercations between the brothers and their parents. In February of 1995, David, Brian, and their cousin, Nelson Ben Birdwell III, stabbed Brenda to death and fatally bludgeoned her husband, Dennis, and their brother Eric at the family's home. The trio then fled the scene in the couple's car. Brenda and Dennis were mutilated nearly beyond recognition, according to law enforcement officials, some of whom described the murders as one of the most brutal acts of violence they had witnessed in their career. 3 days after the killings, authorities captured the Freemans and Birdwell at the Hope, Michigan home of a neo-Nazi associate. Prosecutors charged the defendants as adults, knowing they could face the death penalty if they took their case to a jury. Brian and David each pleaded guilty to a murder charge. They were both sentenced to life in prison without parole. Birdwell took his case to trial and was sentenced to life without parole after being found guilty by a jury. In 2012, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that it's unconstitutional to sentence an offender to life without parole if they were under 18 when they committed the crime. The Freemans won a new sentencing hearing based on the ruling, and in 2024 they were resentenced to 60 years to life in prison. Number 6. Matthew Borges. In November of 2016, a dog walker discovered the decapitated body of a Massachusetts teenager named Lee Manuel Villoria Paulino along the banks of the Merrimack River in the Boston suburb of Lawrence. He had gone missing nearly 2 weeks earlier, and surveillance footage showed the young man walking toward the river with a classmate, Matthew Borges, on the day he vanished. According to prosecutors, Borges stabbed Villoria Paulino to death because he was jealous that the victim had been spending time with a girl. In an attempt to conceal the identity of Villoria Paulino's remains, Borges removed his head and hands. In addition to the surveillance video, investigators connected Borges to the crime through witness accounts, cell phone data, and other evidence. He had reportedly told the girl Villoria Paulino had been spending time with that he didn't like her being friends with men other than him. The day before the murder, Borges had administered an ominous warning that he planned to do something the following day. Following a 9-day trial in 2019, he was found guilty of first-degree murder. Having been tried and convicted as an adult, Borges was sentenced to life with the possibility of parole after 30 years. Number 5. Brandon McCarney. In February of 2008, a California teenager named Larry King approached a basketball player named Brandon McCarney and asked him to be his Valentine in front of the team. King continued to flirt with McCarney as Valentine's Day approached, and McCarney's friends started to laugh at him and tease him about it. McCarney got extremely upset and tried recruiting friends to help him assault King, but nobody was interested. One afternoon, he told a friend of King's to make sure she said goodbye to him because it was the last day she would ever see him. The next morning, McCarney pulled a gun out of his backpack during a morning computer class and shot King twice in the back of the head. He then threw the gun on the floor and exited the room. Police captured him several blocks away just minutes later. In the meantime, King was rushed to the hospital where he was declared brain dead and placed on life support. He passed away 2 days later, and McCarney was charged with murder and a hate crime. Described by Newsweek as the most prominent gay-biased crime in a decade, King's murder garnered national attention. The senseless tragedy drew attention to various issues including gun violence, gender expression, and homophobia. The judge ordered McCarney to stand trial as an adult. Despite the defense's continued attempts to keep the case in juvenile court, McCarney pleaded not guilty and was found competent to stand trial after undergoing a mental evaluation later that year. His first trial ended in a mistrial in 2011 after the jury became hopelessly deadlocked. Prosecutors announced plans to retry McCarney, but he decided to avoid a trial and instead pleaded guilty to second-degree murder, voluntary manslaughter, and a gun charge. He was sentenced to 21 years without credit for time served and is currently serving his time at the infamous Folsom State Prison. Number 4. Lakeith Smith. In 2015, Lakeith Smith and 3 of his friends broke into an empty home in Millbrook, Alabama, to steal an Xbox console and other video gaming equipment. While they were there, the police came and one of the responding officers fatally shot Smith's friend, Adonte Washington. Smith attempted to flee on foot but was apprehended in a nearby wooded area. The officer claimed that Washington had charged at him with a weapon, and while there was no confusion over who fired the fatal shot that killed Washington, authorities charged Smith with felony murder, fully aware that he did not pull the trigger. Under Alabama state law, defendants can be held liable for deaths that occur in their presence during the commission of certain crimes, including burglary. Smith's surviving friends were also charged in connection with the case and received sentences ranging between 17 and 28 years after being tried in juvenile court. But Smith was prosecuted and convicted as an adult, resulting in a 65-year prison sentence. He was placed in a maximum security facility despite his young age. The teen's friends, family, and other supporters felt that it was wrong to imprison him for so long over a police officer's actions. Smith fought his case, and in 2019, the court agreed to reduce his sentence by 10 years. But that still meant that he could easily spend the rest of his life behind bars. In 2023, a judge further reduced Smith's term to 30 years, but he and his loved ones still feel that this is too harsh of a punishment, especially for something he didn't physically do. As things currently stand, Smith will become eligible for parole in the year 2030. In the meantime, the fight for a new trial is ongoing. Number 3. Ashley Dye. In July of 2011, 17-year-old Ashley Nicole Dye fatally shot and stabbed her mother, 62-year-old Brenda Dye, at their home in Stafford, Virginia. The murder sent shockwaves through the community, where Ashley's friends, classmates, and other acquaintances knew her as a normal high schooler with no significant issues in her life. Ashley's father, Ronald Dye, said that his daughter never had behavioral problems until she met her boyfriend, Eddie Wayne Tunin, the previous year. Her grades began to suffer, her behavior changed, and Ashley began arguing frequently with her parents. Ronald believed that Tunin influenced the changes he observed in his daughter. Prosecutors, on the other hand, believed Ashley and Tunin were equal participants in their plot to kill Brenda, which they discussed over text messages prior to the murder. The evidence reportedly showed that Ashley blamed her mother for interfering with her relationship. She had written in her diary over several years about wanting to kill Brenda, later claiming during her trial that the words weren't serious and that she was just blowing off steam. Ashley also tried pinning the blame for her mother's murder on Tunin, claiming that her boyfriend had threatened to end their relationship if she didn't kill Brenda. In 2012, she was tried as an adult and found guilty of first-degree murder. She was sentenced to 38 years in prison. Today's topic was requested by Four Wing Sweeper and Don't Wake the Dead P Janky 9592. If you have any other topics you'd like to learn about, subscribe and let us know in the comments section below. Number 2. Toya Brown. teenage runaway Toya Brown met her trafficker, Garyon L. McLaughlin, while living on the streets of Nashville in 2004. She moved into a hotel with McLaughlin, who made her work as a courtesan in order to financially support them. On an August evening, the young woman met up with a client, 43-year-old real estate agent Johnny Michael Allen, in a Sonic parking lot. She agreed to accompany Allen to his house for a transactional encounter, but ended up shooting him in the back of the head with a .40 caliber handgun. Brown fled the scene in Allen's stolen pickup truck with 2 of his guns and $172 that she had taken from his wallet. She abandoned the truck in a Walmart parking lot and returned to the hotel where she and McLaughlin were staying. Following the discovery of Allen's body, investigators traced the crime to Brown and charged her with homicide, aggravated robbery, handgun possession, and criminal impersonation. She was tried as an adult and was found guilty of first-degree murder, felony murder, and aggravated robbery. Brown was sentenced to life in prison with a mandatory minimum of 51 years, which meant that she would most likely spend the majority of her life behind bars. Years later, in 2017, the young woman's case went viral, thanks to a handful of celebrities who posted about it on social media, including Rihanna, Kim Kardashian, T.I., Snoop Dogg, and LeBron James. Brown's supporters believed her sentence was unfair due to both her young age and her vulnerability due to being a human trafficking victim at the time of the shooting. In 2018, she was granted a clemency hearing. Numerous character witnesses testified in support of Brown's clemency, while others were dead set against it, with one former detective who worked the case testifying that he did not believe the young woman was trafficked. The parole board's votes were split, leaving the decision in the hands of the state's governor, Bill Haslam. In early 2019, Haslam commuted Brown's sentence to 15 years in prison, followed by 10 years of parole. She was released that year and now devotes her efforts to advocating for criminal justice reform and racial equality within the justice system. Brown is also happily married and runs a non-profit that she started with her husband called the Foundation for Justice, Freedom, Mercy, which is dedicated to helping people who are at risk of exploitation and involvement in the criminal justice system. Number 1. Isaiah Ross. North Carolina teenagers Devin Clark and Lyric Woods were murdered in an onslaught of bullets in rural Orange County in September 2018. Their bodies were discovered by a group of ATV riders the day after they had gone missing. More than 4 years later, authorities charged a young man named Isaiah Ross with the murders. According to prosecutors, Ross shot the victims as they tried running away. His motive for killing the pair has not been revealed. In late 2022, prosecutors announced their plans to try Ross as an adult. He was ordered held without bail and the case appears to be ongoing. Thanks for watching. Would 16-year-old you rather get sentenced to 2 years in juvenile correctional facility or to 1 week in Supermax?